And we are back on the build phase. I'm Mr. Ben, and today I am going to talk about something that's not exactly versus, but it is versus related. So there's a concept that I've brought up on this podcast many times, and I have never really had a succinct label for it or a pithy way to describe it. And just now, driving around in my car, listening to a podcast, I heard exactly the right term. So I'm going to spend this commute that I'm on talking about cognitive load, which is the absolute perfect way to describe this concept that I've thrown around with the more complicated language of like forcing your opponent to make decisions or forcing your opponent to think about things. All of that is essentially cognitive load. So what is this concept? All right, to kind of dive into what I'm talking about here, let's look at two different deck archetypes within not only Versus, but many card games, but within the context of Versus. Let's look at aggro decks and control decks. So aggro decks typically come out and are doing one thing, and they're doing that one thing well and repeatedly, and they're just turning right for the most part. Now that's a little reductive. I understand there's nuances in how you navigate aggro matchups, particularly mirror matches or aggro versus aggro, but just broad strokes, let's accept that the cognitive load of piloting an aggro deck is lower than that of a control deck. Again, granted, there are exceptions. The cognitive load of playing against an aggro deck is also lower, and this is where some of the, I think, unfair accusations and disparagement of aggro decks comes from, where it's like, oh, you're making less decisions, you don't have to think as much, therefore this is like a brainless. And first of all, not every person plays games the same way, and not every person wants to play the game the same way every time they play. So as someone who appreciates both aggro and control and mid-range and combo, like I love all the different flavors of things that we can do in our game. So I don't think there's anything inherently less than about playing aggro decks. Now, depending upon the deck, I will offer some harsh criticism about how various aggro decks function. One in particular, I think, probably rises nightmarishly to everyone's mind within Versus circles, and that's, of course, Outriders. And that is a deck that I did kind of levy the accusation of it not only being linear, but being linear in just such a boring way, where all you're doing, you're playing Mordo turning right, you're playing Killmonger turning right, very few decision points that you have to make, and your opponent, similarly, doesn't have a lot of variety in the choices they have to make. They know what you're trying to do, and they're just trying to stop it. Now, let's compare that to a control deck, where you might come out with a relatively low number of decision points in terms of playing against a control deck. So if I'm on a control deck, for the first 2, 3, maybe even 4 turns, I might not be doing very much at all. So I'm not asking a lot of questions, I'm not presenting a lot of threats to you as the person trying to play against the control deck. But once we start up to getting into the higher turns, where important synergistic underdrops can be played together, or where more powerful effects can come into play, the control deck can start to really tax the opponent's ability to make the right decision. They're increasing the cognitive load. For one example, let's look at something like discard. If I'm forcing you to choose cards in your hand to discard over and over throughout the game, those choices get increasingly more difficult and desperate as you see your cards dwindle away. And okay, well, do I keep this one? I can't do anything with this turn, but next turn this would be a critical card. Do I sacrifice this turn to plan for the future? There's all these decision points that you're sort of forcing on your opponent by playing a control deck, and that, by increasing their cognitive load, you increase the likelihood that your opponent will make a mistake. Now, this is, as the cliche says, a double-edged sword, in that often these types of disruptive, reactive control decks also increase the cognitive load on the player who is piloting them, because you have so many more micro decisions. Do I deploy this powerful resource now? Do I wait another turn? How long can I put this off? I can only do this combo once this game. I need to make sure it counts. And there's lots and lots of these little, do I have enough resources, and so on. There's lots and lots of these little checklists, so to speak, that you have to keep track of in your head to make sure that you can pull off whatever your gross unfair feeling end of the game win condition is. So this concept of, I want to automate as many of my decisions as possible. I want to have metrics that I can follow, so I don't have to perform the analysis live at the game in the moment. I know if this, then that, as much as possible with regard to how I pilot my deck. And I want to present novel questions to the opponent that forces them to have to actually crunch the numbers in their head real time, and thereby not just increasing their cognitive load, but by overloading their cognitive processing. And that's a concept that I think is really, really valuable across all card games, but in this context, within the game of Versus. So to go back to our aggro player, there is absolutely a benefit in diminishing your own load. And one of the ways you can do that is by playing a deck that has fewer decision points. You know, on turn 1 you play a 1-drop. You know, on turn 2 you play a 2-drop, or whatever. Or maybe on turn 2 you play the 2 best 1-drops, or a combination of them, or a 2-drop, depending upon whatever puts more attack into play. These are the kind of simple yes-no questions that you can set up for yourself when playing an aggro deck. And by the time you're at the table, if you're doing your playtesting correctly, all this will be automated. You won't even have to think through the decision tree. You just know, in this situation, I play these 2 1-drops, or I play this 2-2-drop, and so on. And then you turn right and like look at the math. Maybe spare a thought for what your opponent might have in their hand, and think about the things that you have to play around. But that's where the majority of the aggro players' cognitive load is going to be devoted. It's going to be devoted to trying to hand read the opponent and making sure that when you make those big pushes to get damage across the board, it actually sticks, it actually gets through. Now, when you're playing against aggro, you maybe have less surprises, you have less again, load in terms of novel questions being asked, but the stakes of the questions are quite a bit higher. If you make one wrong turn and give up a wound unnecessarily against a deck that's trying to tear your face off, that could be the whole game. You could make a misplay on turn 1 that ultimately is the decision that prevented you from having that one more turn to turn the corner, and when the aggro deck starts to run out of gas, take control of the game. So you've got to think about not only the load that you're putting on yourself with your deck choice, but the load you're putting on the other person. And by keeping this concept in mind, I think what we should try to do as players is maximize the differential. So I've said many, many times that putting in reps with the deck is something that you really want to do as far as tournament preparation. I've said many times that playing the best, the tier 1 deck that you're unfamiliar with versus maybe a tier 2 deck that you know inside and out, that it's a mistake to opt for raw power in terms of the cards. And the mistake that's happening there is, and maybe this, I shouldn't speak too generally, but one component of the mistake that's happening there is you're increasing your cognitive load and potentially decreasing the other players. So for example, if we look at like Thorigins, the Origins tournament where like 2/3 of the field played Thor, by opting to play Thor, yeah, the raw power level of the card is going to help you in certain situations, but if you're not familiar with how Thor plays, you're having to ask yourself a lot more questions, you're having to crunch a lot more numbers. And if everybody knows that Thor's the best deck, and of course everybody did know that at that event, that means the people you're playing against have put in a lot of reps against Thor. So by bringing something they're familiar with, you're making their decision trees much easier. You're bringing them a set of decision trees that they probably have done so many times that it's much closer to automated, whereas you're increasing the load on yourself. So choosing a deck you're familiar with. Now, there are limits to this, of course. if you play a lot of kitchen table versus and Kid Kaiju is the deck you're familiar with, I don't think there's any amount of familiarity that is going to help Kid Kaiju bridge the gap to doing well in a tournament situation. There's just too much stacked against that main character. So there are, of course, bounds of reason on everything I'm saying. And like all card games, asterisk, it depends. There's an exception to everything. But the general concept I'm driving at here is that part of your tournament preparation should be thinking about doing as much as possible to diminish the cognitive load that you have on yourself. That could be changing decks. That could be switching to a different main character. But if you're committed to this is the main character I'm going to play, well then putting in reps against different types of decks and trying to think of outside the box combos, even stuff that seems bad at first glance, can sometimes surprise you. And if you don't put enough reps in with it, one example I've talked about a few times is the 2021 Midwinter, where I thought Red Skull would be bad in the format. I built the deck, I played it twice, and it failed in the way that I predicted. And I completely missed the fact that the deck has like an 80% success rate. Like, it failed in the couple of games I put in, confirmation bias, I moved on to something else. And that was absolutely the wrong call for that meta. So getting enough, which can feel frustrating, especially when you only have so much time to test. Putting in testing reps with stuff that you think is a dead end, it is, we're all human. For one, we're all here to have fun with the game. So testing with main characters you don't like or don't enjoy or feel like a dead end can be a real chore, and it's not something I would recommend for casual players. But if we're looking to the tournament table and we're trying to do our best against the best, then there are going to be times where you just have to put the work in, and sometimes that means putting in 10 games with a main character that doesn't feel like it really speaks your language. But that will make you more familiar with how that main character works. And if you run into it at the tournament table, you're going to have a much better chance of having that muscle memory, that automated decision making that is going to reduce your cognitive load. It's going to keep you sharper longer. It's going to keep you better deeper into the tournament. And ultimately, it's going to lead to better decision making and more wins. At the same time, you want to think about ways to front that you have things that you don't. You want to, even if your hand is completely dead, and I don't recommend slow play at all, but even if your hand is dead and you've got a few cards, and when your opponent declares an attack, it never hurts to take a little peek at that hand. Never hurts to pick the cards up, maybe think about it for a second. Even if you know you can't do anything, telling your opponent, oh, I can't, there's no card, my hand's completely busted. Now your opponent doesn't have to think about what you might be doing. And you want to avoid those tells. You want to avoid giving your opponent the safety net of knowing that you can't interact, and now they don't have to spend any time thinking about your interactions, and 100% of their focus is on what the best line is for them. We want to take those opportunities away from our opponent. Now, asterisks on this, be respectful. There is no reason, if your hand is dead, there is no reason to spend more than 5 seconds pretending to think about it. Do not pantomime a multi-minute thinking process at a tournament table. That is bad manners, and I'm not condoning that at all. But there is a line here I think that we can all reasonably walk between auto passing when our hand is dead and being disrespectful in how much time we're pretending to think about things. So this is just one example, or well, a few examples of different ways that you can think about increasing cognitive load on your opponent while decreasing cognitive load on yourself with regard to deck selection and, of course, play choices within the game. Overall, I think I'm going to start using this term a lot more. As soon as I heard the words cognitive load, and it was in reference to information processing, I thought, oh man, I've been talking about this for years on the podcast, and I've never actually had like a pithy label for the concept. I always have to kind of break it down, and well, I should have come up with this. It's not even that complicated of a label, but it really clicked with me, and it made me want to hop on the mic here and talk about not only this new label that I've just discovered, But overall, the concept that I think is one of the... obviously, memorizing cards and knowing game states and being able to keep a clean game state, these are all important skills that you want to have at the tournament table. But as you make your transition from learning the game to trying to develop expertise in the game, cognitive load is one of those concepts that I think all of us, whether you're new to Versus, experienced card player, this is a concept that's portable across multiple games. And if you're interested in constantly trying to improve and constantly trying to be a better player, I think it's a concept that you need to have in mind at every step of the competitive experience, from deck building right up until the playmat. Okay, until next time, go win some games.